May 15th, 2000, Huntsville, Alabama. The start of a new millennium, the year people promised would bring progress, safety, and better days. But for the Kowalski family, it brought only silence. 19-year-old Nora Kowalski was the kind of girl who made the world feel lighter. The youngest in her family, a part-time barista, and a community college student who dreamed of becoming a designer. She loved night drives, old music, and sketching buildings that didn't exist yet. She laughed too loud, worked too hard, and believed her small town was safe enough to trust. That trust would betray her. Her small carriage house apartment sat just off a quiet street in Five Points, a little place tucked behind an older home with a white porch and hydrangeas out front. She'd been renting there for less than a year. To most neighbors, she was just that sweet college girl who always waved. Sunday night bled quietly into Monday morning. Nora had texted her friend Lena about their shift the next day. She'd eaten half a bowl of cereal, left a mystery novel face down on her bed, and turned on her porch light, the soft yellow kind that made her apartment glow like a lantern. No one heard a scream. No glass breaking. No sound of tires. By morning, the light was still burning. The bowl of cereal had gone stale. And Nora was gone. Her best friend Lena arrived at 10 o'clock to pick her up for work. She knocked once, twice. The back door was slightly open. Not forced, not locked, just open. Her heart dropped. Inside, everything felt wrong. Too still. Too clean. Nora's backpack sat on the counter. Her wallet and phone were there. Her keys were missing. A faint smell of coffee and milk lingered, mixed with something colder, the scent of absence. The police would later call it a disappearance. Lena called her name once. Nora? Nothing. The echo of her own voice felt heavy inside the room. She took a hesitant step forward, the door creaking softly as it swung wider. The morning light slanted across the floorboards, catching on small details that told a story no one wanted to read. A half-filled mug of coffee, a phone charger dangling from the wall, a chair slightly out of place. Nora's favorite sweater was draped over the arm of the couch. Her shoes still sat by the door. It looked like she had just stepped outside and would walk back in any moment. But she didn't. Lena's hand shook as she reached for her phone. The air felt thick, pressing down hard, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She called Nora's name again. Louder this time. Still nothing. Her stomach twisted when she looked toward the small kitchen. The bowl of cereal was there, spoon half submerged, milk long dried. On the counter beside it lay Nora's keys, the ones she never left behind. That was when the panic set in. She called 911 with a trembling voice, stumbling through her words. "My friend, she's gone. Her door's open. Her things are here, but she's not." Within minutes, police cars filled the narrow street, their flashing lights painting the morning in harsh blue and red. Curious neighbors gathered behind fences. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a single sound. Detective Elias Vance arrived before noon. Tall, calm, his expression unreadable. He stepped through the door, eyes moving slowly, scanning the scene. "No struggle," he muttered. "No forced entry." He studied the open novel on the bed, the breakfast table, the back door still ajar. It was all too quiet, the kind of quiet that hides something. He turned to the officer nearest him. "She didn't walk out of here by choice." The house fell silent again, except for the soft hum of the porch light that still burned outside. A sign that someone had interrupted an ordinary morning and left the world forever changed. By nightfall, word had spread across Huntsville. A young woman was missing. No sign of a struggle, no reason to run, just gone. Reporters circled the neighborhood like vultures, their cameras flashing against the dark. Every clip of Nora's smiling face replayed across local television. Missing since Monday morning. Detective Elias Vance stood in the yard, watching as officers combed through the grass under fading light. Every few minutes, a camera clicked. capturing the emptiness of that small apartment. The bed untouched, the cereal, the silence. He'd seen dozens of crime scenes in his career, but something about this one felt personal. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was the lack of chaos, how carefully normal it looked, as if whoever took her had stepped straight out of a nightmare wearing a neighbor's smile. Nora's parents arrived just after sunset. Her mother's cry tore through the still air, sharp, broken, unforgettable. Her father tried to hold her, but his own body shook. Simon, her older brother, stood frozen, fists clenched so tight, his knuckles went white. "She wouldn't leave us," he said. "She wouldn't just walk away." Vance didn't answer. He couldn't. The next few days became a blur of search parties, interviews, and sleepless nights. Flyers stapled to trees, her name whispered in grocery aisles, candlelight vigils that smelled like wax and rain. But for all the noise, the truth stayed silent. No one saw a car. No one heard a fight. No one noticed the exact moment the world tilted and a 19-year-old girl vanished into thin air. Weeks passed. Leads died. The story faded from front pages to the back of people's minds, just another headline that lost its urgency. But to her family, every sunrise felt cruel. Every night felt like waiting for a voice that never came back. One thing became certain. The person responsible hadn't just taken a life, they had taken peace from an entire city. That night, Huntsville lost more than a girl. It lost the illusion that safety was guaranteed. Detective Elias Vance was the kind of man who carried his cases like stones in his pockets. He never bragged, never smiled for the cameras, and never believed in luck. In a world obsessed with quick answers, Vance moved slower, deliberate, cautious, stubbornly patient. When he walked into Nora Kowalski's apartment for the second time, the smell of dust and spoiled milk still lingered. The half-eaten cereal bowl had been bagged and tagged. The walls photographed, the air left heavy with questions. He paced the small space, notebook in hand. No broken locks, no overturned furniture, no fingerprints other than Nora's on the surfaces they'd checked. A clean disappearance, the kind that left no story to follow. To him, the absence of chaos was its own kind of violence. Someone had taken Nora without struggle, without panic. It meant she knew them. It meant she trusted them, at least for a second. Outside, officers canvassed the neighborhood, door to door, question after question. Each response was a polite version of, "I didn't see a thing." That silence cut deeper than any confession. Reporters had already filled the street, their microphones pointed at anyone willing to talk. The words missing, mystery, and vanished filled the air like static. Vance ignored them all. He stood by the back door, the same one left slightly open. His gloved hand traced the handle, the faint smudge only visible under light. He noted it, bagged it, sent it off. But even then, he knew it would tell him nothing. The technology wasn't ready, not yet. He stepped outside into the yard where the grass bent under his shoes. The garden was still wet from the night before. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. Just the quiet rhythm of a sprinkler turning lazily in the distance. Vance closed his notebook and muttered to himself, "Whoever did this didn't come to fight. They came to disappear." He didn't know then how right he was, or how long that disappearance would last. The first suspect was the one everyone expected, Zane Miller, the ex-boyfriend. He was 20, an engineering student with a temper he didn't hide well. The breakup had been messy, filled with late-night arguments and jealous calls. Detective Vance met him in a small interview room, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the pauses between words. Zane leaned back in his chair, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Yeah, we fought," he said. "We always fought. But I didn't touch her. I was at my parents' place all weekend." His alibi, confirmed by his father, held. A shaky one, but enough. Vance didn't trust him, but he couldn't hold him either. Next came Dominic Cole, Nora's landlord. A man in his 70s, quiet, slow-moving, with arthritis in both hands. He lived in the main house just a few yards away. He described Nora as polite, hard-working, a good tenant. He winced when asked about the light in her window. "She kept it on late," he said softly. "Studying, I guess. I told her once or twice it bothered me. She apologized. Sweet girl." That line, "the light in her window," stuck with Vance. It seemed small, but small things often were the hinges of truth. A neighbor swore they'd seen a dark sedan idling by the alley the night Nora vanished. Another claimed to have heard something like a cry, faint but real. Officers followed both leads. Nothing. The car was never found. The sound was never verified. The media ran wild with speculation. Talk shows debated whether Nora had run away, whether she'd met someone online, whether the police were hiding something. The cameras flashed, the theories multiplied, and the truth stayed buried under noise. One piece of evidence stood out for a moment: a single light-colored hair found in the cereal bowl. It turned out to belong to a cat, a strange detail, quickly dismissed as contamination. Nora didn't own a pet. Still, Vance wrote it down. He'd learned not to ignore what didn't make sense. Days stretched into weeks. Every theory hit a wall. Every interview ended with another maybe. The city started to lose interest. The headlines softened. The crowds outside the Kowalskis' home thinned. But Vance stayed. Always in that apartment, staring at the open door, the cereal, the silence. He wasn't haunted by what he found, but by what he hadn't. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet streets of Huntsville returned to their routines. But inside the Kowalski home, time didn't move forward, it stalled. Flyers with Nora's photo still lined telephone poles, their edges curling from the summer heat. Her smile stared back at strangers at every gas station, every corner, every grocery store bulletin board. It became a wound the city learned to look away from. Detective Vance visited the Kowalskis often, though each visit felt heavier than the last. Nora's mother rarely came to the door anymore. Her father had stopped shaving, his once strong voice reduced to quiet apologies to a world that refused to answer him. Simon Kowalski, her older brother, refused to let go. He spent his nights creating online pages, posting updates, calling radio stations, begging anyone to remember her name. He printed his own posters when the official ones ran out. "If people stop seeing her," he told Vance one night, "they'll stop caring. And if they stop caring, she'll stay gone." Vance didn't argue. He knew Simon was right. He also knew how cruel time could be. The media lost interest after the first few months. The next big story came along. A robbery, a scandal, a new headline to chase. Nora's disappearance became yesterday's tragedy. Reporters moved on. The cameras turned elsewhere. Inside the evidence room, her case file thickened but never moved. Leads grew colder with every passing day. No witnesses, no suspect strong enough to hold, no body. Still, every time Vance passed that file on the shelf, he stopped. He'd run his hand across the label Kowalski, N, and promise quietly, "Not yet, not over." But even promises grow tired when the world stops listening. By the end of the summer, candlelight vigils burned down to nothing but melted wax and ashes. Attendance dropped from hundreds to a few dozen, then to a handful of faithful faces who refused to forget. Simon stood at the final vigil that year, holding a candle that dripped wax across his knuckles. He didn't flinch. His voice cracked as he spoke to the small crowd. "If the police give up, I won't. If time forgets her, I'll remind it." The wind caught his words and carried them into the dark, where no one could promise they'd be heard. As summer faded, the headlines did too. But grief doesn't care about news cycles. The first year after Nora vanished was loud phones ringing, volunteers searching scrub and creek, neighbors posting photos on lampposts. By the second and third years, the noise thinned. The rallies shrank from hundreds to dozens, then to a core of people who refused to leave a memory behind. Their candles burned down to stubs. Their voices grew hoarse from repeating a name no one wanted to forget. Time did what time does best. It eroded attention. Stories moved on. New headlines pushed old grief to the margins. For most of the city, Nora became a face on a board, a file in an archive, a reminder of something that had once happened and was now someone else's problem. Inside the Kowalski home, nothing moved on. Photographs collected dust at the edges. Nora's room stayed the same, her sketchbook stacked, pencils in a jar, a sweater folded neatly on her chair. Her mother would sometimes sit there and hold the sweater as if it still carried warmth. Her father paced the porch at night, scanning streets that offered no answers. Simon, unwilling to let her slip into silence, turned his grief toward action. He learned social platforms, email lists, and community boards. He called radio shows. He printed flyers until his fingers blistered. Police updates slowed to single-line bulletins. Detectives checked the same leads twice, then once more out of habit. The evidence room gathered layers of paper and plastic. A single small smudge on the back door, once promising, had led nowhere with the tools then available. The cat hair in the bowl was filed away as contamination, a curiosity, nothing more. The months took on a sameness that felt cruel. The same unanswered calls, the same tired faces handing out the same photos. Grief hardened differently in each person. For the Kowalskis, it remained an open wound. For their neighbors, it became a dull ache remembered on anniversaries. For the police, it became a file they carried home, slipped onto a shelf, and sometimes stared at on slow nights. The city learned to live with a missing piece, but the missing piece did not learn to stop hurting. Detective Elias Vance kept his promise in ways that hurt him. He visited the family. He kept records immaculate. He followed tips, even the thin ones that led nowhere. Over the years, those small commitments stacked into exhaustion. Cases filed as inactive become a weight. For Vance, the Kowalski file was not a case number. It was a person who had not been allowed to finish her life. After a decade, Vance retired. He left the badge with a hollow that no retirement party could fill. Walking out of the precinct, he carried the memory of a promise he could not yet complete. He sat with it the way men sit with the memory of a lost ship staring out, thinking of what might have been done differently. He would still visit the Kowalski home sometimes, not as an officer, but as a man who could not let the absence be neat. Simon's refusal to yield became the public heartbeat of the case. Where institutions cooled, he heated things up again. He launched a website, posted anniversary messages, organized small marches, and made sure the phrase, "Find Nora," remained visible. He became the voice that would not let the story be filed away and forgotten. People began to call him stubborn. He preferred the word necessary. The community response split into fatigue and devotion. Some neighbors, tired of the attention, closed their curtains. Others, older residents, friends from school, people Nora had once helped with art projects, kept showing up with homemade posters and leftover candles. Their loyalty was a small, stubborn flame against the long dark of forgetting. Still, practical limits remained. For decades-old leads, the only way forward was new tools or new witnesses. Vance's retirement put a period on his active search, even though he could never truly leave the work behind. The file sat on a shelf in the archives, labeled with dates and numbers. But to Simon and a few others, it was their ongoing task. They refused to let the name become an afterthought. Most people think old crimes stay buried. But truth doesn't die, it just waits. Subscribe before the next story waits too long to be told. If you're still not convinced, comment why your silence might say more than words. A decade after Vance left, the department shifted. Cold cases that once felt hopeless began to attract a new kind of attention. Advances in DNA methods and a will to reopen old files created small teams dedicated to memories that would not stop aching. Detective Aisha Khan arrived with a different posture, younger, technical, and quietly relentless. She did not promise miracles. She promised process. Khan treated the Kowalski file like a problem to be solved step by step. She ordered re-examinations of anything that had been preserved, the bowl, the bed sheets, the smudge on the back door. She asked for inventories, notes, and original photographs. Her team worked nights and weekends, pulling records from boxes that had not been opened in years. Where previous investigators had had limited tools, Khan had algorithms, enhanced testing, and access to databases that barely existed when Nora disappeared. Officer Tegan Holt, new to cold cases but sharp and patient, began re-interviewing neighbors and scanning old phone records with fresh software. Simon met with them and brought old flyers and notes he had kept. He wasn't a detective, but he became their most committed informant. He opened drawers no one else had bothered to open. Khan's approach created momentum. Files once thought inert started to show new marks. A fiber here, a smudge reread by modern machines there. Small things, the grain of an old photograph, an overlooked annotation, began to feel less random and more like pieces that could be fit together if someone had the patience and the tools. The team worked quietly, but with intensity. Each night they tested hypotheses, crossed names off lists, and created new leads. For Simon, the department's renewed interest felt like vindication. For Vance, retired, but watching from the edges, it felt like the next act of a story he had begun. When Khan stood in the evidence room and ran her finger along the labeled boxes, she felt the weight of years. She did not pretend the work would be quick. She knew the obstacles. But she also knew that the case could be different now. The file was cold, but the questions inside it were still burning. Detective Aisha Khan sat alone in the evidence room, surrounded by shelves stacked with sealed boxes, hundreds of them, each one a story of someone who never made it home. The room buzzed softly under its fluorescent hum, but her attention stayed locked on one specific file. Nora Kowalski. The 15th of May, 2000. The folder was heavier than expected. Inside, everything felt trapped in time, photographs printed on glossy paper, handwritten notes from Detective Vance, and plastic sleeves containing small fragments of evidence that hadn't been touched in years. Khan laid them out one by one. The bowl from the breakfast table, the fabric from Nora's bedsheets, the metal handle from the back door. Every piece looked ordinary, but she knew better. The smallest things often carried the loudest truths. They just needed the right kind of ear to listen. The technology at her disposal was a world away from what Vance had in 2000. DNA analysis had evolved. It no longer required large, perfect samples. Now, even the smallest trace could speak. She'd read the original lab report from that year. The smudge on the interior of the back door handle had yielded partial DNA, but the profile had been too faint to read. The file listed it as inconclusive. Khan didn't like inconclusive. She requested permission to resubmit all physical samples for new testing, high-sensitivity amplification, mitochondrial sequencing, and touch DNA extraction. It was a long shot, but long shots were the foundation of cold case work. When the samples returned from the lab 2 weeks later, the results startled her team. The bowl carried traces of Nora's DNA expected, but also something else, faint and unfamiliar. It wasn't human. Under magnification, a single hair fiber stood out fine, light-colored, and belonging to a rare animal species. A Savannah cat. Khan frowned. Did Nora have a pet? Officer Holt shook his head. No cat. No animals at all. That meant one thing. Someone who had been in that kitchen, someone who touched that bowl, carried that hair with them. Khan leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. A forgotten clue from 20 years ago had just taken its first breath again. A week after the new lab results, the department's phone line lit up with a call that felt more like a whisper than an accusation. The voice on the other end was distorted, careful, the kind people use when they think what they know will make them a target. The caller refused to give a name. "Ask about the Midnight Gardener," the voice said, clipped and urgent. "He knows about the lights." Detective Khan sat forward in her chair, the paper in her hand suddenly heavier. She repeated the phrase aloud to her team. The words sounded small, almost silly, until someone remembered an old detail from the original reports. Dominic Cole, the landlord, had once complained about lights in Nora's window. It was a passing line in a file that had been read and reread 100 times, never thought to connect to anything else. Khan called the number from the tip. It was untraceable. She listened instead to context, to the cadence of the caller's voice, to the way they paused before saying midnight. She had a hunch, one of those instincts that comes from years of watching human patterns, and she pushed it. "Who is the midnight gardener?" she asked into the receiver. Silence answered for a long beat. Then, "Ask about the cat," the caller said, and hung up. That small instruction, 3 words, moved the investigation forward faster than a dozen interviews had. Khan ordered a deep dive into pet registries, hobby groups, and old neighborhood forums archived online. Officer Holt began combing through old calls and community bulletin posts, searching for any mention of exotic pets or unusual animal sightings around the 5 Points area in 2000. A lead emerged from an obscure online thread from the early 2000s. A local pet enthusiast forum where someone proudly posted a photo of a large spotted cat named Midnight. The post was dated 2000 and linked to a username that, when followed through other digital traces and public records, connected back to the groundskeeper who had maintained the main house on the Kowalski property. The name on the log was familiar: Silas Thorne. He'd been listed years ago in the original paperwork as a landscaper who worked for Dominic Cole. Then his name faded from the active file, irrelevant, peripheral, an ordinary worker in the background. Now, with one anonymous call and a microscopic hair, the background had moved to the center. Khan felt a hard, focused energy settle in the room. The anonymous voice had done what months of searching had not. It turned a puzzling detail into a path. Someone in the community had remembered the cat and the gardener enough to risk speaking up. That risk mattered. She looked at the lab results again, then at the old file notes on Silas. Each detail began to fit into place in a way it hadn't before. The small, overlooked clue that had once been dismissed as contamination now felt intentional, a strand linking a person to a scene. Khan tapped the phone on her desk and said quietly, "Pull everything on Silas Thorne. Records, permits, photos, everything. We start there." The team moved with a new purpose. The cold case that had been inert for years suddenly had a direction, and the midnight whisper that arrived on a broken line had become the first clear step toward the truth. The deeper they dug into Silas Thorne's past, the quieter the room became. On paper, he looked harmless. A 43-year-old business owner, married, with 2 children. A well-kept lawn, regular church attendance, no criminal history. The kind of man no one watches because he gives them no reason to. But the files told another story, small inconsistencies that time had buried but not erased. In the original report from 2000, Thorne had been described as helpful, polite, routine. He was the last person seen near the property that night, finishing his landscaping work. He had access to the back door. He knew Nora's schedule. He had even been friendly to her passing conversation, occasional jokes about her music, polite nods when she returned home late. Nothing about it had raised alarms back then. Why would it? Khan laid out the timeline on the whiteboard. Sunday night. Nora. Studies late. After midnight. Porch light still on. Landscaper reports finishing yard work around that time. Next morning. Door unlatched. Keys missing. Cereal unfinished. It was too smooth to be coincidence, too clean to be luck. She stood silently for a long time, staring at the evidence, the new DNA printout, the strand of cat hair, the anonymous call transcript. She began to see the pattern not as a story of chaos, but one of control. Someone had entered quietly, left quietly, and lived quietly for 2 decades under the cover of normal life. Officer Holt broke the silence. "You think it was him all along?" Khan didn't answer right away. "I think we missed how ordinary he was," she said finally. "That's what made him invisible." Her phone buzzed. The lab's message was brief. The degraded DNA from the door handle had been successfully amplified using touch analysis. The results showed a mixed sample Nora's genetic material and a partial male profile that matched the sample from the cat hair test. The same person who carried that pet's hair had touched that door. She exhaled slowly. The connection wasn't just suggestive, it was tangible. Science did what people couldn't. she said quietly. It remembered. The next step was confirmation. To tie the partial genetic trace to a living person, they'd need a new sample fresh DNA from Thorne himself. They planned discreet surveillance, waiting for him to drop a coffee cup, a cigarette, anything that would speak for him when his words refused to. As the team gathered their notes, Khan remained still, eyes on the board. For 2 decades, every lead had collapsed into silence. Now, the silence was cracking. The pattern was visible. The story that had stopped abruptly in 2000 had begun moving again. She looked at Nora's photograph, its corners worn from years of being handled, and whispered, "We're coming back for you." Then she turned to her team and said, "Science had done what patience could not. It brought the dead back to the table." The lab's genetic profile didn't produce a direct match in the national database, but it produced something better. A partial family connection. A living relative. The genealogical upload came back with one significant hit, a third cousin match to a woman living in Phoenix, Arizona, named Pilar Ortega. She was retired, quiet, and completely unaware that her DNA, submitted years earlier to a public ancestry site, was about to reopen a 2-decade-old Alabama mystery. Detective Aisha Khan reached out through official channels. Pilar agreed to a conversation, curious but cautious. "I've never been to Alabama," she said when Khan called. "But my grandfather had relatives there a long time ago. My mother mentioned someone who left Cuba in the 70s, settled somewhere in the South. Why? Is this about a crime?" Khan answered carefully. "It might be. We're looking into a cold case involving one of your distant relatives. Nothing for you to worry about. You've already helped more than you know." From that point, the work became painstaking. Khan and Officer Holt built a massive genealogical chart. Names, marriage records, birth certificates, census data. They followed the thread backward through Pilar's family tree and forward into Alabama's public records. The path ran from Savannah to Miami, then north through small towns, until it ended in Huntsville. There, one surname stood out across old employment ledgers and community directories. Thorne. Silas E. Thorne, born 1977, landscaper, employed by Dominic Cole in 2000, lived within walking distance of Nora Kowalski's home. Khan circled the name on the board. "That's our blood link. He fits every proximity marker. He's the gardener." Holt frowned. "The Midnight Gardener?" Khan nodded slowly. "And if that cat hair really came from him, we just found the man who's been standing in the sunlight for 20 years, pretending to be clean." The room fell quiet. It wasn't celebration. It was the weight of finally seeing the face that had been hiding behind the fog of time. Khan looked at Nora's photo taped to the corner of her monitor. Let's see where his roots really go. Officer Holt searched through digital archives, turned up a forum post so old it looked like a fossil. The username matched Silas Thorne's old email. The thread was about exotic pets, dated the summer of 2000. His message read, "My Savannah cat, Midnight, just turned 1. He's a handful, but he's my best friend." Attached was a photo of a tall, spotted cat lounging on a wooden fence. The name jumped out at Khan immediately. Midnight. That was what the caller had said. Ask about the Midnight Gardener. It wasn't a riddle anymore. It was a confession hiding in plain sight. She printed the thread and pinned it beside the genealogy chart. The room now looked like the inside of a mind that refused to let go. Photos, lines, documents, and a growing circle around one name, Silas Thorne. He had access, Khan said quietly. He knew the property better than anyone. He could walk right up to that back door, and no one would think twice. Holt nodded. He'd have a reason to be there at night, checking sprinklers, trimming hedges, whatever his job called for. And he owned a Savannah cat. That hair in the bowl wasn't contamination. It was a footprint he didn't know he left. They both stared at the photo on the board, the grinning, unremarkable man with his hand resting on the spotted cat. Khan sat back. That phrase about the lights, Dominic Cole mentioned once that Nora's study lights stayed on late. What if Silas saw it too? Every night, From the yard? Watching her window? The implication turned the air sharp. Holt swallowed. He wasn't just working. He was watching. Khan's voice hardened. She brought him kindness. He returned it with cyanide. Or something far worse. The image of the cat hair, the open door, the half-eaten cereal bowl. All the tiny, ordinary details rearranged themselves into something brutal and undeniable. Silas Thorne had been there that night. He had spoken to her. He had crossed the small, invisible line between neighborly familiarity and violence. Khan closed the file and looked at Holt. We can't arrest him yet. Not on this. We need confirmation. Holt nodded. DNA. Exactly. We get it without warning him. Quietly. Outside, the evening light slipped across the window. For the first time in 20 years, the investigation had a pulse. Detective Khan didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk long after the rest of the team went home, the soft buzz of the computer fan filling the silence. The pieces were too clear now to ignore. The DNA, the cat, the call, the light in Nora's window, all of it pointed one way. But suspicion wasn't evidence. Proof required patience, and patience was all she had left. The plan was simple, but it had to be flawless. They would watch Silas Thorne without alerting him, wait for the right moment, and collect something he touched, a disposable cup, a cigarette, anything that could yield DNA. It was the only way to confirm what 20 years of searching had been circling around. Officer Holt drew up the surveillance rotation. Thorne's life was routine early mornings. A neat yard, a modest landscaping business in Coral Gables, a wife named Octavia, 2 children in high school, a man surrounded by normalcy, camouflaged by it. He mowed lawns, coached soccer, volunteered at church. Yet, as they watched him from a distance, even his normal behavior felt heavy. The team tracked his schedule for days. He left his house at 7:45 every morning. He drank coffee from the same shop on Madison Avenue, sitting outside for 10 minutes before work. He always ordered the same thing, black, no sugar. He smoked one cigarette, crushed it out neatly, and dropped both the cup and the butt into the trash on his way out. That was their window. Khan watched the live feed from the parked vehicle half a block away. The moment his hand released the coffee cup, she nodded to Holt. Go. Holt stepped out, gloves ready. In seconds, the evidence was bagged, sealed, and labeled. No confrontation, no mistakes. It was clean, quiet, absolute. When they returned to the lab, Dr. Sharma handled the samples herself. She worked in silence, the steady rhythm of precision guiding her movements. Days turned into a week, and each one stretched thinner than the last. Khan's phone finally rang on a Thursday afternoon. The sound cut through the office like a blade. She picked it up, bracing for either another wall or the ending they'd been chasing for 2 decades. On the other end, Dr. Sharma's voice was steady, but charged. The DNA from the cup and cigarette matches the partial profile from the 2000 case. It's the same person. It's him. Khan didn't speak. Holt exhaled, long and low, as if releasing 20 years of ghosts. The net had closed. Nora Kowalski's case was no longer a question mark. It was a name, a face, and a truth about to come crashing into daylight. They watched him like other people watch sunsets quietly, for a long time, waiting for the ordinary to crack. Silas Thorne's life had the comforting rhythm of routine. The same gray suit, the same briefcase, the same slow steps to the bus stop. He smiled at neighbors. He coached youth soccer on weekends. He brought casseroles to church dinners. He was the kind of man people said, "Oh yes, I know him," and meant it as reassurance. Detective Khan's team parked their car half a block away and folded their world to the size of Silas's morning pattern. Officer Holt sat low in the driver's seat, binoculars raised, coffee cooling in his hand. Cameras recorded his movements. A tracker logged his GPS stops. They watched, for deviations, for nervous glances, for anything that would betray the life hidden under the neat routines. The strangest part was how little felt suspicious. He walked with the calm of a man who had rehearsed innocence for years. He checked his phone, adjusted his tie, crossed the street at the light. He was, in every sense the world could see, ordinary. That ordinariness was the danger. It covered him like a coat. It let him move without asking questions. It let him sleep at night and sit through neighborhood potlucks while a family spent years hollowed out by waiting. They tracked him for days. He took the same coffee break at the corner shop, dropped the same cigarette stub into a public bin, tossed the same paper cup into a trash can without thinking twice. Small, careless gestures, perfect for gathering what they needed. Khan watched through the gloom of a late afternoon, while Holt copied the routine into a plan. "He's predictable," Holt said, voice low. "That's our window." They would not make noise. They would not alert him. They would move like shadows, patient and precise, to take one quiet thing he left behind and let science speak in place of rumor. As dusk fell, Silas lifted his cup, drained it, and walked off without a backward glance. Holt eased out of the car, gloves ready. He bent, bagged the cup, and sealed it with the same calm efficiency the team had shown for weeks. No confrontation, no dramatics, just a small, crucial piece of proof tucked away in a sterile bag. They drove back to the lab with the careful silence of people carrying evidence they hoped would finally stop the ache of 2 decades. The lab at headquarters was quiet that night. Dr. Anya Sharma worked alone under the sterile light, her focus fixed on the small evidence bag that carried the story Huntsville had been waiting for. Inside was the discarded coffee cup, the rim smudged by a single careless touch. The cigarette butt lay beside it, marked and sealed, waiting to tell its truth. Detective Khan stood on the other side of the glass, her arms folded tight. She didn't pace. She didn't speak. Every sound, the hum of the centrifuge, the soft tap of a pipette, seemed louder than it should have been. 20 years of unanswered questions had narrowed to this small moment of precision. Dr. Sharma's process was deliberate. She extracted, isolated, amplified, and compared. Each step demanded patience, each movement a ritual against doubt. Sweat formed at her hairline, but her hands stayed steady. She knew the stakes. She knew this wasn't just about solving a case. It was about restoring a voice to someone whose last sound had been lost to time. Hours stretched. The hum of machines filled the space where words would have only added pressure. Holt checked his watch. Khan didn't bother. "Let her work," she said quietly. "We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer." Dr. Sharma finally looked up from her monitor. "The data's clean," she said. "I'll have a comparison ready by morning." Khan nodded, but her jaw stayed tight. Waiting until morning felt like another punishment. When they left the lab, the air outside was thick and gray, clouds swollen with rain. Khan stopped by her car, staring up at the sky. "You can't outrun time," she muttered. "But sometimes you can make it stop long enough to catch the truth." She climbed in, drove back to the precinct, and sat in her office with the case file open, her eyes tracing the photo of Nora Kowalski taped to the inside cover. A girl smiling in sunlight, unaware that her face would become a city's question mark. All that was left now was the call. One phone ring between hope and confirmation. She didn't sleep that night. The rain finally started. It didn't stop. The storm rolled in just before dawn. Heavy rain swept across the city, drumming on the windows of the precinct like a pulse that refused to calm. Khan sat in her office. The lights dimmed, her coat still damp from the walk-in. The old file lay open in front of her, the pages swollen slightly from years of handling. Each note, each photograph, each scrap of paper had become part of her life. Outside, thunder cracked, followed by the slow rumble that filled the spaces between her thoughts. The waiting had turned into a physical thing, a weight pressing against her chest. Every minute that passed stretched longer than the last. Officer Holt sat across from her, staring at the muted television. The news rolled on about traffic, the weather, a local sports score, ordinary life. None of it belonged to this room. The phone sat in the middle of the desk, motionless, a thin line between silence and history. Lightning flashed. The line buzzed once. Khan froze. The second ring came, sharp, clean. She picked it up before the third. Detective Khan. Dr. Sharma's voice was calm, but Khan heard the tremor under it. "We've finished. The DNA from the coffee cup and cigarette. There's no mistake." She paused just long enough for the world to hold its breath. "It matches the sample from the 2000 evidence. The mixed trace on the back door, the hair in the cereal bowl. It's the same person. It's him." For a moment, there was no sound but rain against glass. Holt closed his eyes, leaning forward, with his elbows on his knees. Khan said nothing at first. Then, slowly, she whispered, "After 20 years, the killer had a name." Dr. Sharma exhaled on the other end, half relief, half sorrow. "I'll send the official report in the morning." When the call ended, the room didn't move. The rain kept falling. Khan stood, walked to the window, and watched the city blur into streaks of gray. Every drop felt like time folding in on itself. Holt finally spoke. "We got him." Khan nodded once. "Yeah, but the hard part's next." Outside, thunder rolled again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like the beginning of something, not the end. They chose morning for a reason. People move slowly at first light, and routine gives ways to sudden order. The team moved before dawn, quiet and precise. Detective Aisha Khan stood in the unmarked vehicle with Officer Holt and 2 uniformed officers beside her. Each man and woman knew their role. Contain the scene, limit witnesses, avoid spectacle. Silas Thorne arrived at his small landscaping office just after 7:30, carrying a worn briefcase and humming a tune no one else could hear. He unlocked the door, flipped on the lights, and set his coffee on the counter. He did the ordinary things he had done for 20 years. He seemed, to anyone watching at a distance, like the sort of neighbor you might borrow a ladder from without a second thought. Khan stepped forward, badge visible, voice steady. "Silas Thorne, you're under arrest for the murder of Nora Kowalski." For a beat, he looked as if he might protest. Then it was as if something inside him finally gave. The briefcase slipped from his hand. He made no move to run. His face did not mirror panic so much as a weary acceptance, like a man who had kept a secret too long and found it too heavy to carry any further. The officers cuffed him carefully. He followed their instructions without resistance. As they led him through the small lobby, a neighbor who'd arrived early to drop off supplies froze in the doorway, eyes wide. The news would spread faster than the sun climbed. Khan watched him, cataloging how ordinary he still appeared. Neat shirt, clean nails, the faint trace of dirt under his trimmed fingernails, from years of work with soil and roots. That ordinariness had hidden a crime for 2 decades. Now it made her stomach tighten. Justice felt less like triumph than the righting of an old, aching wrong. Before they put him in the van, Silas turned his head, and almost to himself, said in a voice that held neither plea nor malice, "I thought the sun had finally bleached it away." The sentence landed like cold rain. It told her everything about how he had carried himself, confident that the years would erase what he had done. But time had not erased it. Time had collected evidence, and patience had finally learned to use new tools. They drove him to the precinct under lights and the quiet weight of inevitability. As the car pulled away, neighbors came to their porches, murmuring questions that would become tomorrow's headlines. For a family who had held 2 decades of quiet pain, the sight of him in cuffs was a rupture, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. News of the arrest spread in a matter of hours. Social feeds filled with old photos of Nora. Local channels replayed the same footage of Silas walking into the precinct. The town's reaction was immediate and raw. People who had once waved at him in the grocery aisle now whispered to their neighbors with a new edge of disbelief. At the carriage house where Nora had lived, someone had already taped a fresh photograph to the bulletin board. The image looked the same and different, the same smile, different meaning. A small cluster of neighbors gathered, eyes wet and angry, trying to reconcile the man they'd known with a name tied to murder. At church, parishioners swapped stories about Silas's volunteer work, his attendance at bake sales, the casseroles he'd brought when someone was sick. "He was such a fixture," one woman said, voice cracking. "You would never think." Her sentence drifted, unfinished, as if something inside her had no words big enough to hold it. Reporters pressed family members for comment. Cameras found Simon Kowalski outside the courthouse hours later. He had not planned to speak, but when a microphone was pushed near, he stepped forward. His voice trembled with a grief that had hardened into a steel edge. "The danger wasn't the stranger," Simon said, jaw tight. "It was the man mowing our lawns." Those words cut across the footage like a bell. They made people examine everything they took for granted: neighborly smiles, polite nods, the small kindnesses that can hide a darker line beneath. Editorials debated how such a man could walk among them for so long. Some neighbors defended him, saying people change, people struggle, people deserve the benefit of the doubt. Others insisted that the quietness around him had been a cover and that communities needed better ways to notice the things that matter. At the precinct press conference, Detective Khan stood behind the podium with family members seated nearby. She spoke plainly about evidence, about modern testing, and about the long work that led them there. She did not deliver a speech of gloating. Her words were lean: proof, process, and the result. The most powerful moments came not from claims of heroism, but from the faces in the crowd, the small, steady grief of those who had waited. The arrest changed the town's rhythm. People locked doors they'd left open for years. Parents watched their kids with a different attentiveness. Conversations once polite now carried underlying tension. The shock rippled outward, reshaping daily life in ways big and small. Inside a studio later that evening, Simon sat beneath bright lights and a camera lens that made grief look like a headline. He answered questions with the rawness of someone who had worn the ache for 20 years. "We used to trust people," he said. "You don't just lock your doors because you think the worst. You do it because you learned it." He told the viewers about Nora's laugh, the sketches she left on napkins, the plans she had for her future. He spoke about the small ways the family had tried to keep her presence alive, the way her mother still set a cup of coffee beside a chair where Nora used to sit, the way her father stopped whistling the old songs. His voice broke when he remembered the vigils, the candles, the snow of paper flyers handed out in grocery aisles. Journalists replayed the clip of Silas's calm acceptance as he was led into the precinct. That image, a man who had once been a part of daily life, stuck in people's minds. It unsettled them more than any image of violence would have. The idea that someone ordinary could be a perpetrator undermined the small comforts people used to carry. The hope that the worst dangers come from the edges of society, not from the middle of it. At the courthouse steps, neighbors and friends gathered. Some asked questions, others stayed silent, mouths set. A woman who had known Silas since childhood stood trembling and said, "He never gave me reason to think he'd do something like this." Her words were honest, their meaning complicated and painful. Detective Khan walked through the precinct later with a small stack of files. She felt neither victory nor vengeance so much as tired closure. Justice, she thought, is not a bright thing. It is a hard thing. It arrives with paperwork, testimony, and the slow rigor of the law. It does not bring back the lost, but it places blame where it belongs. That night, as the town tried to process, the anchor lines repeated the same phrase. A man who smiled at neighbors was arrested for murder. Viewers commented, argued, and posted. Suburbs buzzed with late-night conversations. Somewhere between outrage and sorrow, the community began the long work of relearning how to trust and how to watch. Evil hides in quiet faces. If this happened near you, would you see it coming? Subscribe now before the next monster blends into your world. And if you don't believe it could happen, comment why. The interrogation room was unadorned and unforgiving. A metal table, 2 chairs, a single bright light. Silas Thorne sat where he had been placed, hands folded, as if to keep them from moving. Even in cuffs, he looked like someone who measured everything a man used to counting, cataloging, balancing small things into order. Tonight, those skills offered him nothing. Detective Khan read him the basics, the lab results, the match to the 2000 sample, the photo of the forum post, with the cat named Midnight. She watched his face for the flicker that might mean denial, anger, bargaining. Instead, his expression slid from confusion to a flat, careful calm. He did not attack the evidence. He did not insist on his innocence. He listened as if the facts were a lecture he had been waiting to hear. When Khan described the DNA link, the cup, the cigarette, the amplified trace on the backdoor handle, he did something small and human. He breathed out like a man who had been holding his breath for years. His lips moved in a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. No protest came. No lawyer's footsteps echoed down the hall yet. There was time, and something in him chose the confession over a fight. He spoke quietly, almost apologetically at first. He told them how he had worked late that night, checking irrigation lines and equipment. He said he saw her light and felt an old, sharp feeling he could not name. He told them that he had sometimes talked to Nora from the yard, small talk at first, then more personal things as she grew comfortable with him, as she offered him pie when she baked, as she laughed after long nights of study. She was kind to me, he said. She was easy to talk to. She saw me like I wasn't nothing. Khan listened without judgment in her tone, but with a firmness that made space for truth. She asked why he had lied to investigators in 2000. He shrugged. It seemed smaller then, he said. A thing I could hide. A thing I told myself I could make go away. He described the moment that became the end of a life and the beginning of a family's long grief. He had gone to her back door to ask her to lower music or lights, something Dominic Cole had asked him to do. They argued, he said, for only a second. She moved, panicked, to call for help. He grabbed a tool, he called it a trowel, rusty, heavy, just to frighten her into silence. The hit did not break his plan. It broke her skull. He watched as her body went still, as if the air itself had left the room. Silas confessed that in shock, he wrapped her in a tarp he used for yard waste, dragged her to his truck, and drove to a remote area where he buried her beside a shallow culvert. He spoke of mud and leaves and the smell of wet earth like a man naming the steps of an action done so many times it had become a record. He did not weep as he told them. He spoke with the hard calm of a man describing a ledger entry. When Khan asked why he had staged things afterward, why he had wiped the exterior handle and left so little trace, he looked down at his hands and said, "Control. I wanted to believe I could make it neat. If something is tidy, it feels like it can be kept inside a box. I wanted her gone, and the rest of it sealed. I thought if I did it right, nobody would notice." His voice carried no malice in the moment, only a small, terrible pride in the precision of his act. That precision was the very thing that would make the confession land like a hammer in court. When his lawyer finally arrived, the confession stopped and the formal process took over. But the damage was done. A man had spoken and had given the investigators the narrative they needed to match to the forensic record. Courtroom preparation moved quickly. Prosecutors laid out the chain. The bowl with the foreign hair, the backdoor smudge amplified to a profile, the trace from the coffee cup and cigarette matching the partial profile, the forum post linking a man named Silas to a cat named Midnight. Then came the confession, a human voice that had bridged 2 decades. In court, the prosecution presented it in ordered segments. Dr. Anya Sharma testified to the laboratory's methods, how degraded samples can be amplified, how touch DNA yields matches if preserved correctly, how the cat hair's genetic markers pointed to a breed rarely owned in that area and tied directly to registry notes found on an old hobbyist forum. She explained the mixed profile on the handle and how a modern comparison linked that profile to the DNA sample recovered from items taken during the surveillance. Witnesses included neighbors, the landlord Dominic Cole, and threads of archived web posts printed and entered as exhibits. Simon Kowalski gave testimony that was less forensic and more human, a brother's voice describing lost plans, stolen futures, and the long ache of unanswered questions. His testimony had a quiet, terrible power. It reminded the jury that the suffering belonged to real people, not just to paper and evidence. The defense tried to cut at the edges. They argued contamination, questioned chain of custody, and attacked the reliability of genealogical inference. They nudged at the confession, highlighting fatigue and the stress of interrogation, aiming to introduce doubt, but the forensic sequence was tight. The prosecutors had anticipated these attacks and had prepared clear, rigorous responses: the sealed logs, the surveillance documentation, the lab protocols, and the unbroken chain from cup to comparison. Details of the staging were terrible to hear. In court, the prosecuting attorney read from the interview notes. He had wrapped her, moved her, and returned to a routine as if nothing had happened. The description stripped the act of romance or complexity. It became simple and monstrous. A violent impulse executed with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to small, controlled actions. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. Their decision came back with a sentence that many in the gallery had expected and some had prayed for: guilty on first-degree murder. The judge pronounced life without parole. He ordered restitution where possible and acknowledged the family's loss in a way that was procedural but sincere. For Simon and the Kowalskis, the verdict did not return Nora. It placed accountability on a man who had thought the years would cover his tracks. When the gavel fell, the weight of 2 decades shifted slightly. The press swarmed as usual, microphones thrust forward, cameras chasing reactions as if that could measure the work done. The Kowalski family stood together, their faces marked by years of vigil and the particular change that comes with knowing an answer at last. They did not laugh. They did not celebrate. They only allowed themselves a collective, careful exhale. Silas Thorne remained minimally expressive. He sat as if the verdict confirmed something he had expected. He did not weep. He merely accepted the paper and the restraints and the words that ended with the judge's command. When the courtroom cleared, Nora's family stayed behind to leave statements, to hold each other, to trace photographs with fingers that remembered the weight of a life. Detective Khan returned to the precinct and sat alone for a long time. The case file was thick with testimony, with exhibits, with digital records now stored in backups and servers. She placed a hand on Nora's photograph and closed her eyes. Justice had been delivered by law, by science, by persistence, but justice had not healed. The absence remained a raw thing. Vargas, retired but following the case, watched coverage from his chair at home. He felt a complicated relief, not joy, but the knowledge that his silent work had not been wasted. For him and for many others who had kept the file alive, the verdict was a final accounting. It marked the end of a long arc of failure and correction. In private, Simon told detectives that the sentence mattered because it named responsibility aloud. "It doesn't fix anything," he said slowly, "but it shows us we were not wrong to ask for the truth." He placed a small pressed flower in the file on Khan's desk, a thing that belonged to memory rather than proof. The last public line, delivered in court, captured something that would linger. He didn't weep. He just stared like a man still trying to measure the cost of being seen. The image stuck because it condensed the crime into a face. It showed how a life of careful measures had finally been measured back. Outside the courthouse, conversations shifted. People argued about warning signs and about how a community watches its own. The case became a lesson for local agencies and a reference point for training sessions on cold case re-examination and community engagement. Dr. Sharma returned to her lab, not to glory, but to more work, to methods refined, and samples still waiting. The Kowalskis visited Nora's grave once more, with the knowledge that the man who had taken her life would never walk free again. They stood in silence, letting sunlight and wind be their company. The verdict had not stitched the tear, but it had named the seam. Justice had arrived, slow and exacting. It had carried the weight of tools and testimony and time. But the final truth, the memory of a young woman who loved art and music and small late-night conversations, remained with those who loved her, carried forward into days that would never be the same. The case of Nora Kowalski became more than another headline. It became a symbol of persistence, of technology's reach, of what happens when people refuse to let silence write the ending. The story moved through Alabama's news cycles and into national broadcasts, featured in documentaries and criminal justice forums. For every detective who had ever stared at an unsolved file, it stood as a quiet reminder that the story is not over just because the pages gather dust. The Huntsville Police Department launched new initiatives for re-examining unsolved cases. Training programs were built around what had been learned from the Kowalski investigation, how preserved evidence, even fragments decades old, could still speak if handled correctly. Across the country, labs began collaborating with genealogical services, following the same path that had identified Silas Thorne. It became a model for science, serving patients rather than replacing it. Detective Aisha Khan didn't chase credit. When asked to comment for a feature piece on modern forensic work, she said, "We're just caretakers of stories. The science gives them a way to finish." Her line spread through social media, shared by officers, teachers, and advocates. It captured something beyond victory, the understanding that technology can recover truth but not erase the grief it reveals. Retired Detective Elias Vance was invited to the department to speak at the dedication of a new cold case unit office. He stood before younger officers, eyes shadowed by years of memory, and told them, "Sometimes what you need isn't brilliance, it's stubbornness. Keep the file open long enough, and the world will change in ways that help you." His words landed softly, grounded in experience rather than ceremony. For Dr. Anya Sharma, the case reaffirmed her faith in evidence. She later told a local paper, "You don't solve cases like this by chasing luck. You solve them by listening to what time left behind." It was not pride, but quiet belief, the same belief that had kept her in the lab long after others had gone home. The echo of the case rippled outward, shaping how people thought about closure and truth. It did not create comfort, but it created resolve. And in the wake of that resolve, other cold cases began to thaw. For the Kowalski family, closure came softly. It didn't look like happiness. It looked like breathing again, without guilt. They held a small memorial near the wooded area where Nora's remains were found, placing flowers along the stream and reading lines from her old sketchbooks. Her mother said, "We spent years waiting for her voice. Maybe this is how she finally spoke." Simon stood beside them, older now, with streaks of gray near his temples and the calm that comes with surviving what seemed impossible. He spoke to a few local reporters who had come to cover the event. "We didn't find peace," he said plainly. "We found proof, and that's enough." Those words became the headline of the evening news. They captured the contradiction of justice, how it can satisfy and still leave people aching. For the Kowalskis, proof was both an answer and a wound. It confirmed what they feared, but gave them something firm to hold in place of speculation. It meant that the endless, haunting question, what happened to Nora, no longer floated unanswered between every family gathering and every quiet dinner. They donated a portion of the memorial fund to establish a scholarship in Nora's name at the local community college for students studying art and design, the thing she loved. They chose a small plaque, simple and clear, in memory of creativity, kindness, and truth, found too late, but not forgotten. It was modest, but carried weight. Simon visited Khan's office a final time, bringing a single flower pressed in a frame. He thanked her for not giving up, for finishing what his sister never could. Khan accepted it quietly, her voice low. "Sometimes justice is slow," she said, "but it never forgets." The word stayed with Simon, just as Nora's laughter had stayed with him through years of absence. They were both reminders that justice may crawl, but it moves forward, and that memory, even painful, is a form of keeping love alive. Months passed, and Huntsville settled into its new rhythm. The Kowalski story became part of the city's history, told in classrooms, police academies, and neighborhood gatherings. It reminded people to trust their instincts, to notice the small things, and to understand that time may delay truth, but can never destroy it. Detective Khan stayed with the cold case unit. Each morning she passed by the framed photo of Nora on the hallway wall, a small dedication added after the verdict. Below the image was a simple line from Khan's own words: "Justice is slow, but it never forgets." The plaque gleamed faintly under the office lights. A constant reminder to every officer who walked past that persistence was its own kind of courage. Simon moved to a nearby city but returned each spring to visit his sister's resting place. He brought new flowers, spoke quietly, and left without ceremony. The visits were private, unannounced. They weren't for the world, they were for balance, for keeping memory aligned with gratitude rather than only grief. The story of Nora Kowalski lived on as both a warning and a testament. It warned of the dangers that hide behind polite smiles and ordinary lives. It testified to the power of evidence, technology, and persistence. It taught people that even when a case grows cold, love and truth do not. They wait, patient as dawn. And as the years turned, her name stopped being the mark of a tragedy and became the name of endurance proof that what is lost can still be found if enough hearts refuse to stop looking. The closing words from the televised documentary that aired later summed it perfectly. No matter how bright the sun, the past still cast shadows. The screen faded to black. The case was over. But the lesson would keep burning long after.